And welcome to another episode of In Stereo. I'm Mike Bovaird.
And I'm Rick Miller.
And we're talking all things audio. Today's special guest, JR Boisclair from WallyTools.
Yes.
JR, how are you?
I am well.
Good
Thank
to
you
see
for
you.
having me.
Thanks for making the trip.
Thanks for
Good to
having
see
me.
you. Yes. Now, where did you come from? You're a ways away from here.
Sonoma County, California.
Wow. Yeah. You
Wine
did
country.
Wine country.
Yeah.
How any word on the hurricane or?
It's quite a bit south. From
Is
us.
it? Okay.
Yeah. We
good.
would invite the rain if we had it.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
that's good. Now, do you know if they're getting rain back there? They're getting some rain from it?
Haven't been checking.
I've been checking. Okay.
Too busy out here.
Yeah.
Yes.
You've been traveling. So you've been here in Florida helping a couple of our customers, Pat and Mike, and they were looking to fine-tune their cartridges and their setup and get everything to a more perfect level, if you will. And I think you worked with both of them yesterday, and I spoke with both of them this morning, and they were both delighted with the improvements that you were able to make using some of your tools and expertise. And why don't you start by talking a little bit about what you did yesterday?
Oh, okay. So both of them, both Mike and Pat, they hadn't sent me their cartridge for analysis first, which is something we can talk about a little bit. So I didn't know everything about it because there's one parameter in particular, that is zenith error. Again, we'll talk about that in a little bit, that I really need to see under my laboratory microscope, which is impossible to travel with.
Okay.
So that was one parameter we weren't able to optimize. Can only guess where it was. But most of the work that was done was I did bring out my field microscope, the WallyScope, and we optimized for a vertical tracking angle and a stylus rake angle, which are two different things for two different important reasons. Again, we're going to go over this. And then just did the proper horizontal alignment of the stylus and cantilever. But the greatest amount of work was done on the tone arm. Okay. Greatest, both of the tone arms were imparting their own horizontal torque force against the cantilever assembly, and that was impeding performance. And again, we'll talk about the role of the damper, critical part of that cartridge motor that is wildly misunderstood or just not fully appreciated in order to get the most performance. So we worked principally on getting the tone arms under control. Yeah.
Now, you've been involved with WallyTools for how long now?
Well, I met Wally Malowitz in the mid-90s and early mid-90s, and we developed a fast friendship. This is when I was living in Minnesota, and I was his production assistant. I made a few of his products for him.
Nice.
And we had countless conversations, and I learned so much from him. And he passed away in 2018. After he died, I helped his son kind of sort out, who's also a mechanical engineer, sort out all of his equipment, of which he had a copious amount. And during our process of working through his father's estate, I said, hey, I know exactly how your dad did what he did, and I know what he left undone, because there's a lot undone. And I said, how'd you like to be my partner in this, and let's get it back up, spin it back up.
Right.
And it's worked very well. And it's been great for me because he's not just a mechanical engineer, but he was at the time the head of the cardiac division of Medtronic. So he had a team of 200 engineers and scientists reporting to him. And so if ever we had a question about infrared spectrometry or electron microscopy or about metallurgy, or it doesn't matter, about compliance and formulae, we would have resources.
Wow.
Right? And we still do.
Right.
I've now got a team of 3 engineers that together we're doing research on various aspects of of vinyl playback that have not yet been researched, and we know are already yield a great amount of sonic improvement.
Is it hard for you to comprehend that this 120-year-old technology, we're still being able to get more information?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's incredible how much more there is to get from the groove.
Right.
I've had so many clients who've been very happy with their sound.
Right.
Right. And then I said, well, send your cartridge to me.
Right.
Let me analyze it. Send it back to you. It's very easy to reinstall once it's been analyzed, and hit all the marks. And universally, they all say, I didn't know my cartridge could do that. Right? So there are a number of factors that have, a number of playback factors that haven't been well studied. And it's not just on the playback side, and we can go into some of those. It's also on the cutting side, because we're also analyzing in the lab cutting styly. And we're seeing, for example, plenty of cutting styly that are not symmetrical. So they should be 45 degrees and 45 degrees. But we often see, say, 47 and 43 and a half. So now when you have an asymmetric cutting stylus, you guarantee crosstalk cut into the grooves. Now I know for sure, because there's really only one manufacturer of these cutting styluses. Yep.
Really?
And then there's one fella in France who makes them kind of on an ad hoc basis. If these engineers don't know what they're getting, right? I know that because I've been in contact with several of them, and they tell, well, I just get them and I throw them in there, right? And then we've further analyzed test records. I got a stack of 11-inch stack of different laboratory test records, and so we've used a few different methods, including laboratory microscopy and just simply reading the electrical signal they give off from the groove. And we find that even test records are not cut perfectly. All right. Either the stylus has been twisted in the cutter head, so it actually has a cutting zenith error of its own, and there's a number of other possibilities. But so there's an opportunity to get more into the groove by attending with greater alacrity. So how are things aligned at the moment of cutting? Right? Now, then one can say, well, look, if there's so much deviation from perfect, then why are we even bothering? Right? And I say, well, look, there are 4 angles that the cutting engineer is aiming at. All right. And again, we can go into those a little bit later. But we know what they are. 2 of them we know with certainty what they are. And the other 2, we know that what range that they're working within. So on the playback side, knowing this, then we can aim for that mean as well. We can aim for that average on the playback side, and therefore, statistically speaking, get the most information out of all records. Sure, one record will be cut in deviation clockwise, and the other one will cut in deviation counterclockwise, but on average, they're all aiming for the same mean. So it's like any probability curve, right? They will be bundled around the center. The instances will be bundled around the center. So we aim our playback for that center.
Have you noticed any kind of difference in the cutting lathe, whatever, whether its source is a digital file or a tape?
So what you're asking is if I can discern a subjective difference.
Not subjective, because there's maybe artifacts from the tape that could be affecting things.
Nope, that's not an area we've studied.
Okay.
No,
I was always curious about that.
No, not an area we've studied. There's a lot of areas we haven't studied. That's certainly one of them.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
There's a lot of work to be done there.
Yes.
So as good as digital is becoming, and it is becoming wonderful, my point is analog has a lot more to go with what it has to work with already on the cutting side and the playback side.
Right.
There's more to get from the groove. I'm absolutely convinced.
Yeah. I've always, I don't want to turn this into an analog versus digital discussion, but I've always felt after my tour of recording studios, the sort of like aha moment that I had was realizing how I'm trying not to swear here, how crappy the analog to digital converters were being used in the studios, and the amount of compression that they were using was an eye-opening experience for me. And so a lot of people are out there, well, you know, digital's fine, it's superior, it has all these other things, but what they forget is, in order to get that digital file, you need an analog to digital converter. So here we are in the audio community running around trying to find the DAC of the month. You know, there should be a DAC of the month club, but anyway, we're trying to find the most people always ask, what's the most analog sounding DAC, which is really ironic, but they're trying to find the perfect DAC. The reality is you can chase your tail, and those studios that are using these crappy, antiquated, what I witnessed, analog to digital converters, that's the bottleneck right there. There are great analog to digital converters out there. You know, MSB makes one, Merging Technology makes one. There's some fabulous ones. But when I talked to the people that ran the studio and said, why are you using this $1995 $500 analog to digital converter? Their answer was, well, it works. You know, it does the job. You know, instead of something that is going to be far better sounding. You know, and they're budget constrained, so they're not going to go out there and buy a really expensive analog to digital converter.
I know it's disappointing, isn't it?
It is digital
because there's a lot of links in the chain.
It is. So when you have a true end-to-end analog recording and you play it, it is phenomenal. It can be just absolutely wonderful. So I'm not trying to you know, crap on digital, but I'm saying we need to be aware that there is a fundamental flaw in the chain, and it's often the overuse of compression and the analog to digital converters used in the studios.
Yes. Yeah. But in the analog production, in the vinyl production side, there can be overreaches done with compression as well. For example,
it is.
I do reel to reel as well, and I'm in love with reel to reels.
Me too.
I've got this recording by 2XHD of Shirley Horn's "Softly."
I have that.
I love Shirley Horn.
That was the fellow up in Canada that did that.
Yeah,
Renee.
Renee. And on tape, it's explosive.
I know, the dynamics are unreal.
Yeah, pianissimo to fortissimo, it just explodes. On vinyl, it's not there.
It's not there.
It is not there.
Nope.
And it's not because of vinyl.
It's because of
the engineering.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. It was really a disappointment to me.
Agreed. Yeah, I totally agree with you. Look, you've got, so to summarize your company, you have tools that consumers can purchase, and they can use at home. There's guidance and whatnot, and they can do their own improvements on their setup. You also offer an analysis of cartridges, and why don't you talk a little bit about that, because there are some imperfections in even the best cartridges out there.
Well, first of all, anybody who owns my tools is also getting a service. Pretty much 7 days a week. If you got a question, you reach out to me. So I've got people from all over the world who do just that. And sometimes it's a phone call, sometimes it's just email, sometimes it's a video call. Right. So because I know that working with something that involves attention on truly the microscopic level, it's not simple for everybody. Right. And there are forces at play, and there are geometric relationships that are confusing. Right. So yeah, cartridges. So there are 3 manufacturers in the high-end audio world, at least, for stylus cantilever assemblies. Stylus cantilever assembly is comprised of the following parts. There's obviously a stylus at one end, which is attached to a cantilever, which is attached to a coil former, which is perpendicular to the, so if this is a cantilever, there's a coil former at the end, and then the coil is wound around that. Then there's usually a piece of piano wire that acts as the pivot for the whole thing. And then there is a pipe at the end, which is used to affix the whole assembly in to the body of the cartridge. So these 3 manufacturers, there's 2 of them are Japanese, Namiki, which is now called Orbre, and Ogura, and then there's a Swiss one called Geiger. And you can go on the website right now, particularly of Namiki, and you can see what are the tolerances with which they promise their various stylus cantilever assemblies will be assembled. So what is the angular deviation between, see if here's a cantilever and here's that, let's use this, and here's the stylus contact edge. What's the angular deviation that's allowable? And then zenith error, which is the angular deviation between, here's the cantilever, and here's the contact edge. It's this, okay? So what are some of those deviations? Well, I want to focus on the zenith error. That one's my favorite one right now. They promise plus minus 5 degrees.
That's still a lot.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah. Now, most head shells will allow about plus minus 5 degrees of total rotation in the head shell of the cartridge body. All right. So for this to be 5 degrees off, off of perpendicular to the cantilever, that's tantamount to having your cantilever 5 degrees off of alignment at the null point. And which is it's visible from across the room.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it looks wonky as hell.
Right.
But what matters isn't the alignment of the cantilever. That's just our proxy because we can see the cantilever. So we align the cantilever at the null point. But that's not what matters. What matters are the two contact edges of the stylus, the left channel contact edge and the right channel contact edge. If those are out of alignment in the groove, and then you can even see this and feel this. When it's this groove is a horizontally modulated groove. This is a mono signal, or it's at very least the performer right in the center between the two speakers. Same thing, horizontal modulation. When a fine line contact stylus, which is a facsimile of a cutting stylus, when it's properly aligned in the groove, it will go nicely left, right, left, right, left, right. But when you introduce a zenith error, okay, you see I'm twisting it now. Now, yeah, I'm going to go slowly. It goes up, down, left, right, and I can pass this to you and you can feel it. You can feel it. So now the stylus is traveling in an ovular pattern rather than left, right, left, right. Well, that throws off a different electrical signal. The left channel is out of phase with the right channel. It can still sound good, and most people live with this situation. It doesn't mean it's going to sound bad, but it's less of everything. All right?
Yeah.
And at 5 degrees, this is tolerable. All right? This is within industry acceptance. And furthermore, I know that the cartridge manufacturers, by and large, with maybe 2 exceptions, don't know what they're getting from their vendors. And so when we get it, like I've seen a $16,000 cartridge with over 10 degrees of error. I've seen a $4,000 cartridge with 17.5 degrees of zenith error. Okay.
Wow.
So the fact that the vendors are promising them plus minus 5 degrees doesn't limit them from getting much worse.
So the
Yes.
the diamond tip isn't glued properly onto the cantilever.
Yes, it's either not affixed properly to the cantilever, or, and I've seen this too, so the stylus, let's just say, is it's either a rectangle or a square shape, and the cutting edge is, we would think, is orthogonal, meaning a 90-degree relationship with the sides. No, I've seen this. I've seen the contact edge out of orthogonal relationship with the sides.
Jeez.
So when it's easier to see under a microscope the sides than the contact edge, particularly because this is a transparent item and the contact edge is in the center of the transparent item. Illuminating this under a laboratory microscope took me a lot of work. I hired 2 separate material scientists to help me illuminate that and then be able to measure the relationship between that line and something that's hundreds of microns away.
Right.
Way out of the focus field.
Right.
Right? How do you do that without introducing distortions? It's not easy.
Right.
Right? So and so the cartridge building industry, there's a lot of sloppiness, and I don't know about the Swiss Geiger so much. I haven't heard as much from commentary from cartridge manufacturers about what that company is saying. But for the two Japanese companies, and by the way, I love the Japanese stylus. It's my favorite stylus shape. So I'm not knocking on that. But they are not interested in tightening it up. They're too busy, and this issue is too unknown.
So if somebody's purchased a high quality cartridge and they want to be 100% confident, they can send it to you, ideally first before they mount it or anything. And then what process would you go through to perfect it?
Okay. So I take 7 to 10 days.
Okay.
Generally, I can do it faster sometimes as long as we coordinate. I get the cartridge and I put it through a process in the laboratory. I change nothing. I don't touch anything in the cartridge.
You
I don't
just
want
analyze.
Oh yeah,
right?
I do. I will not. Even I've been asked to, and I won't touch the motor. I will not touch that damper. I will not touch the position of the coil former. I'm not going to futz with somebody else's product.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm simply analyzing what's the best orientation for the 4 angles that the client is going to have to implement on their end in order to get the most out of the cartridge.
To compensate for the
to compensate for the there's going to be some error, right? 81 and I database all of my cartridges. Okay, 81.7% of all cartridges have more than a half a degree of zenith error, for example.
Okay,
and the average zenith error is slightly over 2.5 degrees.
Okay.
Which interestingly is right between that tolerance of
and more money doesn't guarantee.
Oh God, no! More money does not guarantee a better alignment.
So you could have a $1,000 cartridge that's really well aligned, and you could have a $10,000 one that's not lined up.
That is correct. Wow. That is correct.
Okay.
And so they send it. I analyze it for those 4 angles, and I do it dynamically. By the way, that means underplay. So there's a compression of the cantilever that happens when it's under play. So I need to know the angles when it's under that drag force compression.
Okay. So it's like you're loading.
I load it. I preload it. Yep. Yeah. And then what I do is I make a compensation shim for each specific cartridge that implements the appropriate SRA and VTA and azimuth in that shim. And then the shim is embossed with what's up, what's forward, and then the serial number, because it's only specific to that cartridge. Right. And then if there's a zenith error, which almost always there is, they use the Wally Zenith to correct for that.
Got it.
Okay. If you've got a Kuzma head shell, you can just send me the head shell and I'll put it on there myself.
Okay.
All right. And then I've got videos on all of this. My website's good. Videos. You've probably seen some of these.
Yeah, it's very good.
And the installation process is easy. So if you got a Kuzma pre-mount, then it's dead easy. There's very little to do. Everything's been mounted for you perfectly on the head shell. You just have to prepare your arm using the Wally reference, and then use the Wally skater and VTF, and you're done. If you don't have a Kuzma arm, then you go through again that process on video to put that shim in the proper orientation. That'll hit your azimuth and SRA VTA. Oh, a quick word about SRA and VTA. So these terms are erroneously in the press used interchangeably, and they're not the same thing at all. So SRA is the angular relationship. So if you're looking at this stylus cantilever assembly from the side, and here's one contact channel. It's the angular relationship between the record surface and this contact edge. Now, if you've got a conical stylus, you don't have SRA. You just have a point touching, right? But with a fine line contact stylus, which is a facsimile, of course, as I mentioned before, of the cutting head stylus, which offers many tracing advantages of the groove content, then you've got to pay attention to that angle. We know how that records lacquers are cut with, and it depends on which engineer you ask, but they're generally within 5 degrees of each other, right? Okay. So Kevin Gray had told me he cuts at 90 degrees. I've had other ones tell me that they cut it slightly less than 90 degrees because it makes for a slightly quieter groove. Okay, fine. But there is something called lacquer springback, so that the angles at which they cut aren't necessarily the effective angles which spring back.
Got it.
And so the science on optimal SRA is almost non-existent. Got it. Right? It's After we're done studying zenith error, we'll move on to SRA and VTA. But SRA is sensitive to horizontal modulations almost entirely. Okay. Now VTA, vertical tracking angle, is the angular relationship between the lacquer surface, and there's two ways to define it, but I'm going to use the practical one. The record or lacquer surface, and a line drawn from the stylus tip to the pivot point of the cantilever. All right, so that angular relationship is the VTA. I've been reading lately. I've been getting into trying to find and scour the Journal of Audio Engineering Society and IEEE for all of the scientific articles I could find on vertical tracking error. Because at the advent of stereo, vertical tracking error, angle I should say, became important. Vertical tracking angle is only important now that with the advent of stereo, there was a vertical component to the cut. Okay? And I have an animation that I show in one of my videos of why this is important. Maybe you saw that. With the advent of stereo now, we're not only doing left, right, they're also doing up, down. So they have something in a cutter head called a torque tube or a torsion tube, which is the cutting equivalent of a cutter head. So they realized that now that they're going to be going up and down, whatever angle that torque tube is at, the playback cantilever should be at as well. Otherwise, distortions will be induced. Those distortions, and you could go to my the video. I'll be doing more videos on this in the future, but for now, there's one on Absolute Sound's YouTube channel. You can link from and there's a link to it from my website showing this animation.
That's great that you have all this instructional information. That's really good.
I'm having fun doing it.
Good. That makes it even better.
And the more I talk about it, the more it deepens, because I talk to people like you guys and you ask really questions I may not have considered before, and okay, well, I got to go home and dive into that. And
great.
So I like talking about this stuff. And so if the playback VTA is off, you get essentially, I'll just make this short. Let's imagine a vertical undulation to the groove, just a nice sine wave. What will happen is that the stylus will go up the groove slowly and down fast, up the groove slowly and down fast. And that induces harmonic distortion and a form of intermodulation distortion. And most of us live with this and don't know.
Yeah.
At all.
No, that's true.
That we don't know. And when it's corrected for, without fail, my clients say, okay, leave it. I don't want to go back to where it was. And because some of these cartridge corrections I have to do are extreme. Wow. Right? These corrective
if you
shims,
looked at it afterwards, it would look all messed up.
Oh yes, I did on my Instagram page recently an image of a Hana Umami that needed 9.4 degrees of correction. Now that thing's sitting like this, right?
Right, and if anybody looked at it, they'd say that's all messed up. Yeah.
Oh, it sounds great.
Sounds great now.
If you heard it level, and then there's just no two ways about it. It's interesting to note that the scientists who were studying VTA in the early 60s were saying at the time, cartridge manufacturers need to get on board.
So
with they knew back
at the time,
then, and it's still not being respected today.
Oh my gosh!
Because we do not see cutting angles at 30 plus degrees, and we regularly see playback cartridges at 30 plus degrees. Will it play a record? Yes. Will it sound nice? Yes. Will it sound as good as it could? No.
So how do you deal if Kevin Gray's cutting at 90? What is Bernie Grunman cutting at?
Oh, I don't know. I haven't spoken to
You haven't talked to him? Okay.
No.
I'm just wondering how you deal with those variances.
So when we started modeling, the early work in modeling up the distortions created by stylus rake error in finite element analysis to understand what are the mechanical distortions thrown off by it. And here's the happy news. The happy news is that the distortions created by SRA, and I believe at this point, but we'll know more later, VTA as well, the distortions created by small angular errors are not great. Not like azimuth, which is hypersensitive, and not like zenith error, which is the second most sensitive. Like azimuth, if you're a half a degree on, you could hear that. Half a degree off of ideal, you could hear that once I corrected it.
Right.
I don't believe I could hear a half a degree of SRA. No way. I just don't. I don't believe it.
Yeah.
Now that does, when people say, "But I raise or lower my tone arm by 2 millimeters and I can hear a difference," I'm not saying that you can't hear a difference. Okay, though it would be nice, it would be fun to blind test you on that. I'm not saying you can't hear a difference, but when you change the height of a tone arm, you're almost universally changing VTF.
Correct.
On some tone arms, you're also changing azimuth, and you're certainly changing the vector forces about the pivot area.
And some manufacturers, you can do it on the fly, while you're listening
That's right.
to music.
And I'm not a fan of on the fly. I'm not a fan.
But even regardless of the thickness of the record, so if you're going from a 150 to a 200, you're saying it's still going to adjust it. It's still going to affect it.
Yeah. So, okay. So, and that's a good question. So in our record collections, if we take the thinnest record versus the thickest record, now let's eliminate Dynaflex, or what's called Dynaflab, right? Let's eliminate those because those are very thin, right? Because none of us really listen to that, right? Okay. No. That was a product of the petroleum shortage, right?
Yes.
All right. If we eliminate those, and we eliminate the thick-ass 78.
Yes.
Right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
The difference between the thickest and thinnest record in your collection is about 1.1 millimeters.
Okay.
Now, on a 9-inch tone arm, that's a 1/4 of a degree difference on SRA and VTA. Okay. There are some tone arms that have the center of gravity so far away from the pivot point that will make a substantive and audible VTF change.
Yeah.
Okay. There are some that will.
Okay.
So I will not and cannot say that you're not hearing a difference that is limited or restricted to the thickness of the record. However, that is an incredibly difficult claim to make because it's 2 different records, 2 different stampers, probably 2 different engineers.
2 different mastering.
That's an incredibly difficult claim to make. And in our world of audiophilia, we're very bad at controlling for variables when we make a subjective assessment about something.
You're right.
We're really bad at it. So, I want to go listen to the so-and-so turntable, so I'm going to go to Joe's house because he's got it. No. You're going to hear everything. You're going to hear the room. You're going to hear the speakers. You're going to hear the setup. You're going to, you're not going to hear the turntable.
Right.
Right.
Does the tone arm type, like a unipivot or a gimbal, affect any of this in any different way?
Sure. Yeah, I'm not, it's no.
Is a unipivot better at managing some of these or worse?
Okay, so a unipivot is very inexpensive to manufacture. Right. It's very simple. It's a point, and then there's a cup on there with a low center of gravity. All right? Very inexpensive. Low friction. That's very nice. Problem is, the content that's in the groove that we can hear, and I did a video on this called The Microscopic World of Analog. The content that's in the groove that we can resolve through speakers or headphones can be measured conservatively in the low triple-digit nanometer range. Now, a nanometer is a millionth of a millimeter, right? Low triple-digit nanometer is a shorter distance than the wavelength of a violet light. So you couldn't even use the most powerful optical microscope to resolve that. But we can hear it, okay?
Wow.
I'm going to get to your question. But don't let me lose my way, because that's entirely unlikely. Okay,
no problem.
so that's the cost of the prize, right? Now, how do we resolve that? How do we get that information into an electrical signal and then amplified? Well, we need to position the cartridge and therefore the stylus perfectly over the groove. Now, the ideal tone arm would have infinite mass and infinite rigidity. Wouldn't move for anything, wouldn't resonate for anything, wouldn't vibrate at all. It would just be rock solid, and every bit of energy in that groove would be translated into electrical signal. Unfortunately, that's impractical. We've got to allow a horizontal moment of freedom and a vertical moment of freedom. But we don't need to introduce a third moment of freedom that unstabilized unipivots
And that's
do.
what you get with a unipivot, right?
And when you introduce that third moment of freedom, you're offering a third opportunity, a third moment of inertia to take energy from the groove. So one sonic characteristic of free rolling unipivots, we'll call them free rollers, right? Unstabilized free rollers, is that they lack bass authority, and they lack overall focus and clarity compared to when you stabilize them. Well, this is why I did a video for the VPI unipivot arm on how to properly install that dual pivot, which stabilizes that arm, right? Because people are putting that in incorrectly. They're putting way too much frictional force on that point. And I won't go over the details, but there's a way to measure that frictional force using a Wally scale. There's a way to measure that frictional force so that you can elevate, and I promise that arm will be elevated in performance if you put that on properly.
Interesting.
Because it eliminates that moment of freedom.
Right.
And then there are other ways to stabilize unipivots, and some of them use a rigid coupling, like, for example, the bassist tone arm, or a magnet coupling, like the Graham. But even magnets, while they do a good job of holding two portions in relationship to each other, they're not particularly good at holding those positions in the micron range. And there's a lot of freedom actually in the micron range. And remember that our prize is measured in the nanometer range. So while I'm not saying that any such tone arm will sound bad, no. I'm saying it's offering an opportunity to lose information. That's all.
We're talking about getting the most possible.
Yeah.
So for people who aren't really, into vinyl, or they maybe have a very basic setup, all of this perfection and setup is really about, and correct me if I'm wrong, retrieving the micro details and the nuances and hearing everything that's in the groove, essentially. So in a practical sense, you talk about the decay on a piano. If it's not properly set up, it's just going to be like thunk and it's over, as opposed to this beautiful long decay. Things like that. Those are what you really get when everything is set up perfectly.
Yes. Yeah. And yes, you get all of the audio files.
Right. You get all the audio files.
You get all the you get more inner detail. You get that better decay.
Right.
Yes, you are correct. And there's plenty of audio files that aren't interested in that audio file level minutia.
That's true.
But there's something else you get that everybody appreciates. Clarity.
Yeah.
And it sounds less like a stereo. It sounds less like you're listening to
more like
an electronic representation.
And more like music.
It's that experience. You just feel the muscles in your shoulders and your neck just kind of relax.
Yeah.
That's what you get when everything is dialed in.
Yeah. Now, offline, we were having an interesting discussion about the different turntable types. You've got your direct drive, your belt drive, your rim, the new magnet technology from Esoteric, which we both find very interesting. And, our customers that we've sold them to have been delighted with the results. But do you want to talk a little bit about that, how you find the fundamental differences between, the belt and the direct drive and some of the other types that are out there?
Okay, well, first, a disclaimer, that's not an area of expertise for me, right? But I get to experience a lot of designs. And there are great implementations of any one of these designs, right? Any one of these design approaches, let's say. And so that's the first question. Is it a good implementation of that design selection, whether it's, direct or belt? I am significantly encouraged by the developments in direct drive technology. Cogless motors are very common now. First of all, that was the first important thing to get over. Then the next thing to get over was how to control for current ripple. That is, as the stator moves from magnet to magnet, there's a change in current, but with our computing technology, the motor can anticipate it and eliminate it, right? So that was the next thing. So that's doable. Then the next thing is discretization of sampling speed. So I think pretty much anybody can do rotation on average 33 1/3, right? The question is, at what level of discretization is sampling that speed and correcting for it important? And when you correct for it, how much torque do we got to work with? Meaning how long, or in other ways to put it, how long will it take to get it back up to the speed it needs to be at?
Correct.
I would rather listen to my record rotating at 32 RPM constantly at a tiny level of discretization than listen to it on average 33 and a third, but stylus drag is actually having, when louder, more complex passages in the groove have a higher coefficient of friction, therefore more drag force, which will momentarily slow down a platter, even very, very heavy platters.
Yes,
right?
Correct.
So it is very interesting to hear people like Richard Krebs, the designer of the OMA table, talk about how he put together a listening panel to listen for. At what level is this discretization audible? How often should we sample for the speed, the current speed, and then correct for it, right? Now, they use a really high torque motor, right, in that turntable. And their answer that they came up with is they could hear changes to performance by attending to the rotational speed at the arc second level. Now, there are 1.29 million arc seconds in one revolution. That's the equivalent of about 770,000 times sampling per second.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now put that in relationship to digital, right?
No comparison.
So that's one manufacturer saying that's what they've. I've got no reason to disbelieve them, but let's just put this in perspective, right? I got a lot of respect for Richard Krebs, but it is a manufacturing claim, and let's just understand that this is worthy of more investigation.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
But they're saying that their listening panel could hear improvements sampling at 770,000 times per second.
Wow.
Right? But they're using a motor that could then do something about it immediately because of really high torque, right? Yeah. So that's an example of fantastic engineering of a direct drive.
Yeah.
Right? Now there are other fantastic examples of a belt drive implementation as well.
But the knock against the direct drive has always been that this motor sitting underneath the platter oscillates, even the slightest bit, causing micro vibrations. Movement. Yeah, that's always been the knock because it's sitting right underneath the platter.
The bearing and noise and the movement.
Yeah. I mean, early, yes, it was cogging and it was other things like that. But I mean, today that's always been the knock and how you can properly isolate that.
I'm no expert on this.
Me either.
This is the question I would pose to your question. Okay. If we know if it's not cogging, and we've taken care of even current ripple, right? So it's just constantly moving nice and smoothly, right? The next question is, where is another source of noise? And it would be, just as you mentioned, the bearing in that motor.
Right.
But platters have bearings too, right? And so if the bearing in the motor is also the bearing for the platter, then we still have the same problem. Same question about how much is that bearing causing noise as if we had a belt drive, right? A belt drive, we've still got a question about bearing noise, right? But if you can have the same bearing supporting the platter is also the bearing in the motor, it's the same question you would have about that bearing noise for a belt drive.
Unless it's further away. If you've separated it, you've got the motor on one side.
Well, that's what the belt is there to do. But there are a number of rigid belts on the market now, right? And you've seen some, right? Rigid belts, so which aren't doing much filtering,
right?
And
rim drives don't really seem that popular today. There's very few of those out there.
Yeah, and so again the bearing, if the bearing in the motor is also the bearing for the platter, you'd still have a bearing in a belt drive. Right. And yes, you'd have two. You'd have one in the motor and one in the platter.
You help the belt isolates the one in the motor from the platter.
That's the goal. Is the rubber. Yes, the belt.
The belt separates what separates a number of anomalies that can happen in the motor of the belt drive turntable. There might be cogging. They might not be doing anything about a ripple current, and of course the bearing of the motor. The belt helps filter that out.
And, you know,
but it
like
still has a bearing on the platter.
50 years ago, Lynn came out when their big claim to fame was the bearing noise. You know, they had this special bearing, and they said it made the least amount of noise. And even Herb Reichert is measured with a stethoscope, and he says, well, the Lynn has the least amount of noise, you know, I can hear. So that was their big thing, trying to get the micro detail by reducing the bearing noise. But I see what you're talking about. If you build the motor onto that bearing, you still have the bearing no matter what.
Still have a bearing. You're going to have to have a bearing there.
Yeah, you always have to have a bearing, unless it's magnetic levitation.
And I'm not trying to be a champion for
no,
particular. It just, these are fascinating questions.
Agreed.
And there's a lot to look forward to in vinyl playback.
Absolutely true. Let me, so we haven't talked about, I'm curious your take on suspended turntables versus non-suspended turntables.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So I'm definitely a fan. Okay, so I don't care about whether a turntable is suspended or not, but I am definitely going to isolate it. Okay. I've got an SME 30 as my main table, and then with a Kuzma arm on it, and that's got quite a suspension on it. But it's benefited greatly by putting it on top of a -K or a size me on.
Yeah, the -K is great.
Or the EVPs by Norman Varney at AV Room Service. It really benefited. So what I tell people, particularly people who are looking to save a little money, I said, don't buy, save your money, don't buy a turntable with suspension right now. And when you get some money, get an isolation platform for it, right? A good one. There's a lot to be said for the mass loading too, because rigidity, the turntable, the entirety of it, the cartridge, the tone arm, and the turntable itself, it's a mechanical transcription device. It is meant to convert one form of energy into another, right? So, and that, remember we talked already about how sensitive that cartridge motor is.
Right.
Incredibly sensitive. So with the same sensitivity with which it can pick up nanometer level content from the groove, it can also pick up environmental noise or self noise, obviously, like we were talking from the turntable. The higher mass anything is, there's a formula we use a lot at WAM Engineering with the engineers. Force equals mass times acceleration. We use it a lot. In fact, if I were to ever make a turntable, I'd probably name it force equals mass times acceleration. we use this a lot, and it's basically a formula that is related to how much force and acceleration is, how much mass and acceleration is necessary in order to impart a force on anything. Now, we don't want, the only thing we want imparting a force in our mechanical transcription system is the force created by the dragging of that stylus through the groove. That's the only force we want involved in sending information to that cartridge motor. If a turntable is really lightweight, it is easily subject to environmental vibrations.
Right.
Very, very easily, right? Because it's got a low mass, so it doesn't take much acceleration to impart a force.
Right.
Okay. If it's a very high mass, it takes a lot more acceleration to impart a force.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so so there's a significant argument to be made for high mass in a turntable.
Now the people with low mass say, well, the force hits it, but it dissipates quicker. It doesn't store it and let it dissipate over a longer period of time.
Yeah, where does it dissipate to?
Whatever it's connected to.
What's it connected to?
Its base. Its support.
So you're saying, so let's say there's a turntable. Let's say there's a turntable right here.
Yeah.
Right.
And I impart a force. I impart a force to the table it's resting on. What's keeping it from entering that turntable?
Just whatever is keeping the turntable off of the support. You know, like you said, those EV pads or
some sort of isolation would be the only way.
If it was suspended or if it was solid. Or,
and I agree. Like if you were to put EVPs under here or a -K or whatever, it would isolate it. But those devices work with specific amplitude at specific frequencies, right? So they will, and what they're still capable of transferring force. I mean, I've got a minus K, and I can still, on a non-moving record,
perfect.
What's that?
They're not perfect.
No, they won't perfectly avoid the transmission of force. I can see it at home, even with my minus K with the SME. Non-moving record, put the stylus on it, turn up the volume a little bit, hit my heel to the floor. I can get that woofer to move just a little bit, right? Nothing like it used to, right? So, but if that turntable weren't as heavy, that's sitting on that minus K, it would be shaking even more. That woofer will be shaking it even more. Why? Force equals mass times acceleration. The more mass that's on that vibration isolation system, the less likely it is to be moved by any forces that aren't filtered out by that whatever it's sitting on. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Let's talk about a problem that we've had some calls about, and that's rumble. You know, people are playing a record and overactive bass woofers just going crazy. Yeah.
Okay. There's two main sources of it.
Okay.
The more common one amongst most of us are radial warps in the record. So the two kinds of warps in a record, either concavity or convexity. That's one type of warp, right? Depending on whether you put it up one side or the other, you got convex or concave. That's fixed either by reflex clamp, vacuum hold down, or the outer ring clamps with a center clamp, okay? But there are then these radial warps. So if the record, let's just use a Wally, the back side of so I'm not flashing the lights in me. So center of the record, if there's a warp that runs radially, so that you see that when you're looking at the cartridge, you see it go boop, boop, boop. Yeah. That's a radial warp.
Every time it comes around.
Every time it comes around, those will definitely cause that rumble, and you'll see the woofer go.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it is interesting to note that if the cartridge were critically damped, it would do this. That's critically damped.
Right.
One full sine wave and you're done.
Right.
That's critically damped. But what you don't, you see this.
Right.
Right. That's underdamped.
Yeah.
Right.
And then overdamped would be this.
Right.
You just come back to mean. You don't even cross over and go, okay. So what's the question?
How can customers solve that problem?
Okay. All right. So with regards to radial warps, those are tough. When I have them, that record, after I clean it with and I like the Kirmes system, is my favorite. But it takes a lot of work, but it's great. I then put the record into an orb flattener, and those work.
I've seen those.
They work.
Yeah.
They work. That's one of the better investments.
So you have to flatten the record.
Flatten the record, yeah. I've tried the less expensive ones that are two steel plates, and you put it in effectively a heating pad.
Right.
And I had some disasters.
Okay.
That didn't quite work out for me.
Okay.
The orb has been great.
The orb is good.
Yeah, the Furutech makes a fantastic one as well. I'm sure they're not the only ones.
Yeah.
And so getting rid of the source of the problem would be a good thing, because that's causing, besides just the rumble and the challenges that's causing for the amplifier and the stress on the speaker, that's causing stress on the cartridge damper, which we're going to have to talk about.
Right.
Okay. My favorite part of the cartridge, the damper. So if you can't get that warp out, either by means of vacuum hold down or edge clamping or preferably flattening, then you got to use a rumble filter, which the entirety of the audio signal will go through. Now, the other source of rumble will be self-generated noise. So if you're not isolating, especially your subwoofers, but also your main speakers from your floor by means of compliant things like EVPs or other, then the energy will transmit, mechanical energy will transmit from the subwoofer, from the speaker into your structure. And now it's in the structure, not only are you going to hear that, and you don't know you're hearing that,
right?
It's going to find its way into the rack and up to the turntable.
Into the
and
record,
if the turntable isn't well isolated, you're going to feed back.
Just a loop.
And it's a constant feedback loop, right?
Yep.
So that's another form of rumble. And that's relatively easy to take care of, right? And even on concrete on grade rooms.
Really?
Oh yeah. Just in the past 2 weeks, I've had 2 people who put EVPs underneath their subwoofers,
and they had
in concrete on grade,
wow.
Not just suspended concrete. Well, I've heard that, but concrete on grade. They say, wow, I won't take those out.
Yeah,
but it's amazing how much energy can transmit
even through concrete.
Well, I heard even if you live by a busy road, the traffic, like at rush hour,
if
there's
absolutely.
a lot of traffic, that it'll come up in your turntable if you live close enough.
Interesting thing. He'll go on nameless because he didn't give me permission, but a very famous audiophile editor sent me his cartridge because it suddenly wasn't playing any longer. It said, all I get is just distortion. And I tried cleaning the stylus and it's not working. Well, his turntable is he lives in New York City, and he lives near a busy area, a busy road, apparently. And his turntable, what he does, he has a cover for his turntable. He's got a record that he just places on there. He never plays the record, right?
It's just a dust cover.
The record it's a dust cover, right? And so that's all I really know. When I see this thing under my microscope, it's coated with black stuff, like soot. It looks like soot. And it took me a long time wet cleaning that off, right? A long time. And by the way, every 3 weeks you should wet clean your stylus. Even just distilled water is fine, right? But avoid alcohol or solvents. Anyway, so it took me a while to get off, and there it is, beautiful stylus. It's in good position. It's not ruined. Plays great. So I told him, there's this sticky black stuff on your stylus, and it was definitely going to keep it from playing anything. He said, oh, I know what happened. He said, I was out of town, and my son had a little party. And somebody played that record. Yeah. But this isn't the first time that I've, to your point about being near a busy road.
Right.
This isn't the first time that I've spoken to clients where they tell me that I've seen on their stylus this really fine, black, sticky soot.
Wow.
Right? So if you live near a busy thoroughfare,
the pollution comes in.
Make sure you're definitely wet cleaning your stylus and take care of that. And he said, on that side of the house, when we dust, it's like this black filmy dust. That's kind of hard to get up. On the other side of the house, we don't have that.
Wow.
So I don't know what's being, it's a soot from the tailpipes or what. I don't know.
Here we worry about if you live close to the water, the salts.
That's right. We worry about the salt here.
Sometimes.
Oh wow. And the other part of your business is your consulting and traveling around, and you've been very busy with that lately.
I'm right now on a 5-city tour right now. Yeah.
So you are going into the customers and basically assessing their setup. Ideally, they would send you their cartridge ahead of time.
Ideally. I love it when but I love it when people have heard their cartridge first and then send to me. And then listen to it.
Before and after.
Because then they know what they're getting.
Right.
But some of them are just straight from the manufacturer or the distributor to me.
Right.
And by the way, you asked about cartridge quality. 1 in 7.5 cartridges fail to meet manufacturer standards.
Wow.
7.5.
Regardless of price.
Regardless of price. Now, what are those standards? The standards are either articulated on the manufacturer's website or they're articulated by Ogura, Namiki, Geiger. Okay? And in some cases, like in the case of Geiger and Ogura, they aren't articulated on a website, but I know what they are because they've been shared with me by 1 in 7.5.
Wow. So buy 8 from Suncoast Audio and you'll get a winner.
So
exactly.
So and people live with various forms of lack of spec and live happily with it.
Sure.
But don't know they should be getting better performance.
Right.
Now, what was the question you asked me?
Now I forget. No, your other part of your service, the consulting.
Oh, yeah. So yeah. So some people just, you know, when I'm in a particular, actually on my website, I post my travel schedule. So if you're on my website and you see your city there, then you don't need to pay for my travel costs.
Right.
I'm already there.
Right.
Right. And so it's a little bit cheaper.
Right.
And then we'll definitely we'll take care of your analog rig. But I also travel with my Audiomatica Clio system, which is an electroacoustic analysis system.
Oh, for doing room treatments.
Yeah,
cool.
It's my other area of passion is acoustics and psychoacoustics.
Very cool.
That I don't really talk about much. No.
Yeah.
And my particular area of focus is bass.
It's all about the bass.
It's all about the bass.
That's what she said.
And so there's so I want to get a good idea of what's happening in the room. The common
problem is bass.
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Yes. So when you propagate bass symmetrically into a room, which is what most all of us do because we got full range speakers, you guarantee that both the left and the right speaker will exacerbate the same room modes. So, which means that the best locations in your room to propagate bass is almost never where the best locations to propagate the rest of the statistical region. There are two regions of human hearing, right?
That's absolutely true.
We've
done our own measurements. It was in a corner, and we were like, this is the best spot for bass. Well, you're not going to sit in the corner, right?
No sound staging there.
Yeah.
So there's two regions of acoustics that are within human hearing. There's the modal region, which is 20 hertz to about 160. And then there's the statistical region from 160 on up. And these two regions behave very differently in a room. So the modal region is my area of, I just love focusing on the modal region. I mean, certainly, like I did yesterday at Mike's place, we were able to see electroacoustically which of the surfaces were causing the biggest problem for reflections, right?
Okay.
And you can see it, how much of a problem is it. Here, if the original impulse is this big, but then 5 milliseconds later, you got one almost as large, well, you're going to need to take care of that one. Because that one is going to cause problems psychoacoustically.
Correct.
Right? So in the modal region, any speaker designer, they could make the perfect subwoofer, the perfect bass response. And let's just say it's the fastest, best transient response, and it's nice, even frequency response. That's in an anechoic chamber.
Correct.
Or quasi-anechoic. We don't experience bass that way. We experience bass modally, meaning we require the room boundaries in order to hear it. Okay? So if I were to lift a speaker up 100 feet in the air, and then lift you up, also 100 feet in the air, 10 feet away from it, you would hear no bass from that speaker
Correct.
Until it hits the ground and comes back to you.
Right.
Okay? Because any frequency that is shorter than the distance between you and the speaker requires it to bounce off another surface in order for you to hear it. And then it requires a few of the sine waves to resolve any pitch. Okay? So this is why bass can never be time aligned. All right, any frequency that is greater than the distance between you and the speaker can't be time aligned, and that's okay. Once we get into the mode, that is okay. Okay. But to propagate, because of these room modes, which are certainly a function of the dimensions of the room, but also of the construction of the room. Okay.
Correct.
And they're exacerbated differently depending on where bass is being propagated from. And of course, where you're measuring from.
And ultimately where the person's sitting as well.
Yep.
Correct. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So my favorite thing by far to do is a distributed bass array where you got 4 subwoofers, and they don't need to be big, and I'm completely subwoofer agnostic. I don't care.
That's what I have. 4 subs and a 14 by 22.
Beautiful.
It works perfect.
And then I measure where in the room are the best locations to put them.
Yep.
And then use it, and then never will all 4 subs have the same crossover point, the same amplitude,
correct,
or the same phase relationship.
I have 3 in phase and 1 out of phase.
Okay,
and it's perfect.
Yeah, that's typically what happens with me as well. One is good out of phase, but then I also want continuous phase, and then I will play with continuous phase as well, not just 0 or 180, but 0 through 180.
Correct.
Right? And then you've probably noticed that bass sounds pretty much the same everywhere in the room.
Yes. And I've gotten it so well dialed in my room that I can't even tell. I mean, you just don't. Half the time I'm like, damn, they're not working. And you get up and you're like, oh, they are. You know, and it's taken a long time to get them dialed in. And then, you know, there's so many audiophiles out there. Oh, you know, subwoofers are a weakness in your speaker, and they all this wrong information.
They're just not implementing it.
And there's so many people out there. I'm going to buy 1 subwoofer, and I always tell them, you buy 2, 4, or none.
Yes,
that's the bottom line. Never 1.
Yeah,
you know, because you'll be able to isolate it right away, and it's not going to do anything. It'll probably make it worse if anything else.
I've never done a satisfactory job with 1 ever that I was ever. And remember, it's not just the frequency response that I care about; it's the time decay. I think time decay is even more important. And with a distributed bass array properly installed, I can consistently get a 30 dB drop all the way down to 20 hertz in less than 350 milliseconds. That is remarkable. That's tight bass.
Yeah. The other problem we don't talk about is that there are speakers out there that are voiced with a certain, you know, I don't want to say BBC curve, but there's certain peaks at certain frequencies. And if that frequency is a problem in your room, then you're going to make it 10 times worse.
Yeah.
So, you know, I used to own a speaker. The problem in my room is 73 hertz. Okay, that frequency is a nightmare in my particular room. I had a speaker that had its peak in that bass region at 73 hertz. And it sounded like I had 15, you know, misaligned cheap subwoofers in my room. It was a disaster. Not the speaker's fault, but a combination of the problem of my room and the problem with the speaker, or the voicing of the speaker, I should say. So yes, that's something else people need to take into consideration.
You know, look, as far as measurements go, right now there are people very pro and very con. There's some things that can be measured that can't be heard. There's some things that can be heard that can't be measured.
Correct.
But there are some real basic essentials that can be measured. And if you aren't measuring and doing something with the results, then you're missing opportunities.
Exactly.
No, I completely agree with you. In fact, my listening room is part of the house. It's like a big great room, so it's connected to the kitchen and the dining room, and it's all one big area. And I've got 12 subwoofers.
I was going to ask you, how many subs do you have?
12.
And you should see his system sounds amazing. Amazing.
Really?
Yes.
So when I go to a thrift shop or a yard sale and I see a subwoofer, it's cheap, I get it.
He calls me. No, it's true. He'll call me and say, "Oh, I found this subwoofer at Goodwill for $20. You're not going to believe it." But you take it home and make it better. That's cheating.
No, it isn't. That's science.
He takes it apart and says, "I'll make this thing better." You know.
Oh wow, that's interesting.
So that's really breaking up. But when you get down really low into the modal region, like you said, then that starts to fall apart, and you have to go to the walls of the room, like constraint layer dampening. The walls become bass absorbers when you get down really, really low, like 20 cycles and below. You know. But for above that, the distributed bass array. There's a company called Swarm.
That's James Romain, Audiokinesis, and Duke Lejeune. I know those guys well.
Todd Welty of JBL, he did some great work on the research of more than
that's right. Welty and Geddes.
Earl Geddes.
These are PhD acousticians that figured this out a while ago. And this is a little secret that is well known. Well, it's not well known in audiophile circles, but it's been implemented for some time in the home theater.
In home theater, and on the pro side.
And for whatever reason, audiophiles aren't glomming onto this. I don't understand why.
Well, they see subwoofers as a weakness, and they see there's a lot of things which is just not true.
Not audiophile approved.
Yeah,
it's not on the list.
If you have to have a subwoofer in your,
you're cheating.
That's missing the boat.
That's a flaw in your speaker. We hear it all the time.
Can you? Just give us the basics.
Wait, one more thing. I had a question on the related to the subwoofers. Have you had any experience with there's a product I believe out of Switzerland. It's AVA, and it's kind of an active bass trap. Have you had any experience with that?
So I know what you're talking about. I've had no direct I've had no experience directly with it. With active bass canceling, I think it's promising, but it still requires you, at least in my opinion, to use your electroacoustic measurements in order to implement it properly.
Absolutely agree. Absolutely,
and it's not just about frequency response. You have to get quick decay.
Yeah, we've become a dealer for this company. We haven't received our demo product yet, but we've heard a lot of really good things from other people.
I think
about
it's
it.
Promising.
Yeah, I mean, because not everybody wants to put 4 subwoofers and bass traps, and then you and I could talk about the actual effectiveness of bass traps. They just don't do what a lot of people.
Many things are called bass traps
that they're not going to.
And there's a formula to determine whether it's even a bass trap or not.
Exactly. Yeah. Sorry, Rick. Go ahead.
No, I'll just say you brought in all these nice instruments here. We really haven't talked much about it. Can you give us a quick rundown on some of the products you sell?
Yeah, and I didn't bring all of them here. I didn't bring my Wally scope or the Wally reference.
These are your most popular ones.
Yeah, right? the Wally tractor is one of the 2 basics. All right, so the Wally tractor is meant to get proper horizontal alignment of your stylus and cantilever, overhang, and offset angle. Okay, and it's a universal, so it's meant to be able to use not with just about any tone arm. There's a couple of tone arms that, since I have redesigned this, that aren't included. I've got to update it for that, and or even a linear tracker. Okay, so that's one of the 2 basics. The other basic, and my favorite tool, is the Wally Skater. I love this tool. This measures horizontal forces in the tone arm and static frictional forces in the tone arm. And it does so by measuring horizontal force as a percentage of your VTF. And that's significant because the studies, several were done, in the 50s and 60s, and I think even the early 70s, on understanding skating force. And skating force has been understood scientifically as or rather measured as a percentage of your vertical tracking force. There are two things that create skating force that you need, and if you don't have both of them, you don't have skating force. One, you need friction, all right, which VTF delivers. Friction between a stylus and a groove. Next thing you need, and this is not specifically named, this is a name that we've come up with because a name hasn't been given to it, effective moment arm. Effective moment arm is a geometric function. And the reason why we had to give a name to it is because a number of the scientific studies that have been done on skating force aren't correct.
Wow.
And they point at offset angle as being the driving force of skating force, one of the 2 besides friction. But that's like a 3rd order derivative. Overhang is the offset angle is only necessary because there is overhang, and overhang is only necessary.
They're all interrelated.
Yes, and overhang is only necessary in order to hit two null points across the record surface. And I did a video series, a very short video series, one of the, I think maybe the first video series I ever did, showing how offset angle has nothing to do with skating force, right? And that it's not until you create an overhang that it starts happening. But if you use what we're calling effective moment arm, you can calculate, using effective moment arm, how skating force actually changes from one radius to another radius, right? And well, that's like the 3rd study that we need to do, because we haven't submitted any scientific paper on that yet. We got to get done with zenith error first, and that's proving to be a difficult one. And then I want to focus on SRA and VTA, and then ultimately skating force. But the Wally Skater is what I used a great deal yesterday at Pat and Mike's place. Okay. Because and I always use this before I even align the cartridge, because I want to know that the tone arm isn't imparting its own horizontal force to the cartridge before I align it. Why do I care about that? Because as you lower I don't use this. Okay, as you lower the stylus to the Wally tractor, or any protractor for that matter, if there is a horizontal torque force, then what will happen? As soon as it lands and the arm is no longer sitting on the cueing arm, it will go like this, boop, like that, okay? Because the torque force is pushing this way. Now, you're tasked with aligning this cantilever with the null point, but this torque force is causing a visual error for you. And you think you need to rotate the cartridge. You don't. It's a torque force that's causing this visual error. You have to correct for that first. Okay. And if you've got an exposed loop of wire in your arm, like both Mike and Pat did, we were able to alleviate that. Okay, so that was step number 1.
From the wire.
Yeah, the wire. We were able to alleviate it by redressing the wire.
I've never heard that before. That's
any tone arm with an exposed loop of wire is more prone to this issue.
On the outside.
Good information.
Yeah,
on the outside.
Okay, so that's why we use it first before we even measure anti-skating. All right, so if it does exist, and I've seen it in captive wire arms as well, many times, and I've seen it in linear bearing arms many times. Okay, in fact, there's one linear bearing arm where it was design defective. All the arms were exhibiting this horizontal torque force. Wow. So you're paying extra for a tangential tracker, and nobody's getting it. No one is getting it because these wires are imparting too much torque force. Right. So, so the manufacturer, once we brought that to his attention, to his credit, has fixed the issue. Good. Right.
So like where you were yesterday, what do? Do you move the wire? Do you bend the wire?
So yesterday, and I had to disconnect. It was a Kuzma. Both of them were Kuzmas. And so I disconnected. There's a barrel mount where the cable comes out of, and that attaches rigidly to the base. So I disconnected it, rotated it full 360 degrees, tried it again. Oh, that was the wrong way. And then that way it imparted even more force. So then I did it 720 degrees, the opposite direction, right? Yeah. So, okay, that's better, but it's still not perfect. We'll try that. Okay, then I just started playing with the wire itself. I formed maybe a tighter loop or a wider loop, or I moved to this position, and you can see it while this tone arm is hanging from the Wally skater. You can watch how it's doing that. So I got it to the point where I got that horizontal torque force down to 3-4%. Remember, these are measured as percentages of VTF.
The effect of the
I'm
wire.
okay with 3-4%. All right. Yeah. Once it gets up to 7, 8, 9%, I'm concerned. But for tone arms that you can't do anything about that with, as long as you know that force exists, you can still do a workaround. While you're aligning the cantilever at the null point, you reach around with your right finger and you just feather the cueing lever so that the stylus doesn't fully land on the protractor, on the Wally tractor, right? As long as it doesn't land, then that torque force won't kick in. Right. Okay. Then measuring static friction. I want to know that as the stylus gets dragged by the groove across the record, that the arm doesn't want to resist the movement. Right? So this measures static friction. How much horizontal torque force is required to get the arm to move at all? Right. All right. And I've seen some disasters in design there. In fact, there's one very expensive tone arm with a anti-skate device the arm works perfectly with no anti-skate. Right? No horizontal torque force, no stiction whatsoever. But as soon as you implement that anti-skating device on that tone arm, it locks up. It doesn't want to move.
Wow.
Yeah. And people don't know that this exists. Right. So what happens if you've got high stiction? Stylus gets lowered into the groove, and the groove is a spiral, so it starts traveling along. But the arm's not moving. And now look what's happening to my cantilever angle. Right? Yeah. And then finally there will be enough force imparted, and then it moves along for the ride. Right? Wow. But it's going to move along for the ride, and 3 things are going wrong. One, probably one thing that first people will notice, there will be uneven stylus and groove wear, right? 2, because of this twist, the left channel contact point and the right channel contact point of the stylus are out of alignment with each other. So now you get phase error. Right. But third, and this goes, now I'm dovetailing into the damper.
Uh-huh.
All right. And this is my favorite thing. So remember I said that in the stylus cantilever assembly, you got stylus, the cantilever, the coil former, and behind that is an elastomer. It's the damper. And that elastomer has got a very critical role. So when they insert this whole assembly into the cartridge body, they do a little tugging of that on the assembly against the damper to slightly compress the damper.
Okay.
And then they lock it into position, right? Now, under this high static friction situation, one side of the damper is being highly compressed and the other side is being uncompressed, right? So to what scale is that being done? Well, cantilevers are about 6 millimeters in length, and the coil former from its center to the edge is about 1 millimeter. So there's a 6-to-1 lever force action. So for every 1 unit of force down here, you got to multiply by 6 on one side of the damper and minus 6 on the other side of the damper. So let's just say you're one of the smart guys who designs a towing arm, and you say, we don't need skating force, anti-skating force, right? Our cartridge. Okay. Skating force is on average about 10% of your VTF. Okay. So let's say your VTF is 2 grams and you follow manufacturer advice and you don't use an anti-skating force. That means there will be about 0.2 grams of skating force that's 10%, on that stylus. Now, multiply that by 6. 1.2 grams of asymmetric force on that damper. So you got 1.2 grams on one side of compression and minus 1.2 grams on the other side.
That's
okay.
huge.
So now, what's that going to do? Now, the coil former is out of symmetrical alignment with the magnetic flux field, and you've got an asymmetric compression on the damper, which is there to perform a very important dynamic function. It, of course, yes, it's there to make sure that the coil former is symmetrically aligned the magnetic flux field. It's also there to act as a form of shock absorber, right, to the whole system. But when it's asymmetrically loaded, you can be sure that, well, yes, it can still play well. It could even sound good, but it's not performing to its best.
Right.
So the majority, the bigger component of what the improvement that I did at these 2 homes, I feel, I did a few things, but was making sure the tone arm was behaving properly. And in so doing, I was relieving that damper of excessive asymmetric force. Subjectively, what you can expect when you do that, it breathes easier. The music sounds more natural and organic, less like you're listening to a stereo. The soundstage opens up. Things sound more supple rather than, kind of tightened up. And most of us live with this and don't know it. Most of us are happy with what we got, but don't know you paid for more.
You've heard it in the first place. You don't know what
you don't know it missing. Yeah.
So that damper, will that dry out or age and be not as good years from now as it is in the beginning?
I suppose the answer to that depends on what that elastomer is made from. Right. Certainly things like if there is any made from latex, those age. But you're reaching into an area that I don't know much about, so I wouldn't know what's the best type of damper or not. This is a future area of study, I suppose. Yeah.
So this machine that you guys have, that will help a person, and if you're there, you'll do it. But I mean, to get that tone arm right.
Yeah. This makes sure that the tone arm has got good basic hygiene.
Great.
Make sure that it's behaving itself so that the cartridge can perform to its best.
Right.
My favorite. This has solved more problems than any other tool I've got. In fact, mistracking. I like to talk about this. So mistracking is often heard in the form of sibilance. Right? On female voice or on horn blats, right?
They're really annoying.
You hear this break, and it's pretty obvious, right?
Right.
That's the most common form of mistracking. And most people think that mistracking is a cartridge problem. And while it is true and has been well studied that misalignment of the cartridge will increase the probability of mistracking, and lack of attention to proper skating force will cause more likely cause mistracking. It's not the cartridge, in my opinion, that's causing it to happen in most all cases. It's the tone arm. but the cartridges get the blame. Oh, this cartridge isn't a good tracker.
Yeah, I remember Shure used to tout theirs had such great tracking.
And
the
it does.
V15.
It's got this soft suspension. Okay, right?
Right.
And yes, and let's just say that cartridge was designed to work under very dysfunctional tone arm conditions.
Oh, yeah.
Okay?
That's a good way of putting it.
Okay, very dysfunctional.
Yeah.
But these high-performance cartridges are more fussy, and for good reason.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So almost always, easily 80% or more of the cases where we're getting that sibilance and mistracking, or certainly groove skipping, oh Lord. It's because the tone arm's horizontal forces are out of control. Not enough anti-skating, too much anti-skating, or high static friction.
Got it.
Right?
Yeah.
And this is not something that can be measured electrically, reliably at all. We've tried. Right. This is something that needs to be measured mechanically, because it is a mechanical issue.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, if you're dealing with sibilance issues, almost always we can resolve it with this. I tell people first, there's 4 steps I tell them to go through.
Right.
1, make sure your VTF is set correctly. And that means use a calibration weight first. Yeah. Right. I like the Riverstone audio scale from Amazon at $45. It's great.
Does the job.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep.
Secondly, besides using calibration weight, you're probably measuring too high. And I showed the fellas yesterday because I did this as well. My client that just came from New Orleans, they both had the same scale. And that scale measures too high above the surface. So I showed them. First, we calibrated both my scale and their scale. And we measured with VTF on my scale and VTF on their scale, which measures higher up. There was a difference of 0.12 grams. Now that's significant.
So what did you do? How did you set it?
The reason why they're measuring differently is because they were measuring at different altitudes.
Yeah, it needs to be the same height as
like it's
record.
Down more,
right?
It's up more.
Yeah. Now,
got it.
This will happen. I knew that I would find this on their arms because it just so happens the last 3 clients I've been to, they all have Kuzmas. Okay. And Kuzmas, the center of gravity of the arm is not coincident with the horizontal pivot.
Right.
Okay. And there's nothing wrong with that in design, by the way. In fact, there's actually some advantages. But one of the disadvantages is as you change either the tone arm height or the height at which you're measuring the vertical tracking force, you'll get different readings.
Yeah.
Okay. So the Riverstone audio, you can bend that platform down. Every scale I have, and I have 3 different scales, I've had to modify the platform in some way. They're all too high.
Yep, I do the same thing.
They're all too high, right? But the Riverstone audio, it's easy. You just bend it down.
Okay.
And make sure it's not touching the platter, right? Yeah. Where was I going with that?
which is better, to have too much or too little tracking force? If you're uncertain.
I tell my clients, once I leave them, I say, now get used to this sound. And now I want you to start experimenting with going lower and lower in tracking force. All things being equal, there are quite a number of advantages of being low as possible on tracking force. And it's not just about groove and stylus wear, which is the obvious one.
Yeah.
The other one is that your absolute skating force, range, because skating force is a range. There's not, it is true, there's not one target. It depends, skating force will change depending on the radius that you play. And the coefficient of friction of the record, which changes based upon a number of things, including the amplitude in the groove. Right?
Yeah.
So I tell them, what I want you to do, get used to the sound, and now start experimenting with going lower and lower on your tracking force.
Right.
Until once you get any sibilance, you got to back up. Right. And as you change your if you start dropping your skating force, your vertical tracking force significantly, you might have to readjust your anti-skating, because remember, anti-skating is always a percentage of your VTF, right? And what you generally start until you hit a limit, generally start picking up is just more suppleness. All right. So the range with which you will get, the absolute range with which skating force will vary across a record and across groove amplitudes at a lower VTF is much smaller than with high VTF.
Now, if you go too light in your tracking weight and you get into mistracking, can that permanently damage the record?
Yes, mistracking is the primary cause of record damage.
Okay, so you don't want to go too low and get into that mistracking.
If you start hearing sibilance, you've gone too far.
And then one last thing, if you go heavier, I've heard you get more bass. The bass comes up. Is that true?
Well, the question then becomes, is that because of extra
or changing
VTF,
the SRA,
changing the VTA and SRA?
Yeah.
So this has also been studied in scientific literature. At the higher tracking force, the variation with which VTA changes based upon groove amplitude or coefficient of friction will change much more wildly at a high tracking force than it will at a low tracking force. That's another advantage of going with a lower tracking force. Now, there's one cartridge brand, Hanawa. They're known, not Hana, but Hanawa. They're famous for ultra low impedance coils. Like their lowest impedance coil is like 0.5 ohms.
Wow.
Right? But what's interesting about them is they've also been made to play at very, very low VTFs. And in fact, I've heard that the top of the line model, somebody's even told me they're playing at 0.6 grams.
Wow.
Okay. Now,
under a gram?
Yeah.
Wow.
And I've got the second level model as one of my cartridges, and I've been playing that 1.4 grams. But what you find is characteristic of what I find. I think I'm finding a characteristic of cartridges with low VTFs. They have this suppleness to them.
More air kind of thing?
It's this flow, this organic
fluidity.
Yeah. It's a
They're
lack
not going
of
through
harshness.
the groove with a hammer. It's going through
there's something delicate about it. That it's hard to put into words.
Well, Rick uses a penny, so maybe you switch to the dime next time on top of the head cell.
A little less heavy. Yeah,
that's a good idea, Mike.
Or a light washer.
Something like that. Don't go to him for turntable advice. Go to Mike Malley. Mike
Malley.
Mike O'Malley. Mike O'Malley, you need to give us some feedback. Give us some of your thoughts here. You're our turntable guru.
Yeah.
People can't see him. He's behind. But go ahead and speak, Mike.
Yeah, I don't have a camera on me. The only real thing that I would be curious about would be variable anti-skate. You know, have you thought about that at all?
Yeah.
Like variable anti-skate, because you can only choose. You only have one option.
Yep. Yeah. So there are some tone arm designers, and one that's currently in development actually, that have a tone arm anti-skate mechanism that varies the anti-skate weight depending on the playing radius. Now, technically, this is the right thing to do. In fact, the Graham arm employs a variable anti-skate function depending on the playing radius. And technically, that's the right thing to do. The one thing that hasn't been done yet is to also monitor a groove friction, right?
Sure.
Which probably could only be done by also monitoring amplitude, right? Although there are other things that go into it, like if a record has high amounts of plasticizers in it, which means it's relatively soft, which means there will be more deflection in the groove surface, which increases friction, right? That's not something I think you could tell dynamically.
I've got a question. I have to cut in right now, but Mike Malley, you can pick this back up. Now, I heard this 50 years ago. A guy told me this in the early 70s. He said, if you play a record, you have to wait 24 hours before you play it again, because the heat of the stylus going through the groove will deflect those grooves. If you play it again, you'll permanently alter the record. Truth or fiction?
So I found no good evidence in the scientific literature for that to be applicable to what we do now. Okay. If you're playing at 3.5 grams, you run a higher risk of creating a problem that requires you to than if you are playing at 1.8 grams.
Right.
Okay. The transmissibility of heat from a substance like diamond to PVC is not good. It's not a good transfer function. That doesn't, and I've seen some studies on that. And then I've got a stack of papers I haven't read yet from the scientific journals on analog playback, and the ones I'm saving for later. There's 2 of them related to this issue about groove deformation and groove wear. But I have to temper what I read with the knowledge that these scientists at the time were using mostly spherical, rather conical styli. Conical styli have a smaller contact area than modern line contact. These are actually gentler on the grooves, not harsher on the grooves. This ridge line here, there's a radius there. It's called the minor radius, and the idea is to get the greatest faithfulness from the record groove is to have that radius be approaching the radius of the cutting stylus, which is about 2 microns.
Okay.
Now, I've seen in the microscope some styli that are at 2 microns radius. I've seen it, right?
Yeah.
And most of them are about 2.5, 3.5. And there's no problem or risk to that, as far as I can see, because the surface area that weight is distributed under is greater.
So in the 50 years ago, when they had the more round stylus,
they were generating more heat. That's my hypothesis.
More tracking force,
and the
arms were
shit.
And what were the arms doing?
Edit that,
Yeah.
Mike.
This is a family show, right?
Yeah.
I said shit.
Young children might be watching.
Yeah.
I didn't say that. So in those days, there could be some truth to that.
Yes,
theory.
I don't know with certainty about all the approaches. Generally, the better papers will spell out all the details by which they conducted the experiment.
Yes.
That's a hallmark of a good written scientific document, right? Here's all of the variables we used and the order with which you used them. Not all of them do that, so they don't all spell that out. So it's hard to tell all the time.
And they're still making the Denon 103, with the conical, and people are using it and they like it.
Yeah, and look, you can people who like their conicals, I would say this to them. First of all, there is no lacquer that's ever been cut by a conical stylus. Okay. This has never happened. Okay,
Ever.
It's always
It's
you can't get the chip out with a cone, right? It has to have a flat facet to it, so it has a sharp edge to cut that out.
Because they call it a cutter head. That's
right, the cutter head and the cutting stylus. So that's to start. Now, we know what shape has cut the groove. Right? But we insist on using a different shape with which to retrace it. Well, then that which is fine, but it means, and this has been well documented. Okay, this is not just JR saying this. This is very well documented, not just 1 or 2 studies, but multiple. A conical stylus then makes it mechanically certain that there will be mechanical distortions. The path with which the stylus will trace through the groove will not be the same path with which the cutterhead stylus traveled.
Yes.
Okay? It's a mechanical certainty.
Yeah.
Right? Which will cause some actually pleasing second and third order harmonic distortion.
Oh,
okay.
Pleasing distortion.
It can
add
create
that to your tubing.
Yep. So, but it's mechanical distortion, which is anathema to me. Right? I don't have a problem with adding second and third order distortion. I mean, it's done in one of my amps as a pass amp. Deliberately put a little bit in there, right?
Yeah.
And I had no problem with that. But I don't want it done mechanically, because when you do it mechanically, it also means you're skipping over other information. You're obscuring other information. You're obfuscating other information.
Great point.
And I want all of the information collected. What I do with it later in the electronic chain, that's under my control, right? I could change from a solid state amp to a tube amp or whatever tweaked. Yeah, that's my choice.
But if you don't retrieve
it, you can't
re-retrieve
it. All right. So so there's much to be so conical stylus, something called pinch effect, and you've seen it here, right? And you can feel it when you misalign it. It will this is a horizontally modulated groove, but a misalignment of a fine line contact stylus forces a vertical excursion. All right.
And the other channel is going vertically, right? So you're adding information.
Both channels at different times are going vertically. Yes. A conical stylus does that all day. All day.
So it's giving you a voltage that
it's called pinch effect, and it's been documented again many times over in the past. And pinch effect is worse at 33 RPM than it is at 78, and 45 is it's less of a problem than 33. And pinch effect becomes worse at the inner area of the record than at the outer area of the record because the density of information on a linear basis is more compact. All right. But yet this dimension doesn't change. All right. So there are some mono cartridges out there that don't allow vertical excursion. In my opinion, those are damaging your records. They don't, remember what I said here. It's like there's been this amnesia amongst some cartridge designers. They've forgotten that a conical stylus, which is what they use, a conical stylus doesn't force a vertical excursion. It does. This is very well documented. And in their wisdom, they've decided that they will not allow a vertical excursion of that cantilever. But yet pinch effect is happening. So that means when that conical stylus wants to travel up, it's going to take the entire arm with it. And that's a recipe for certain groove damage over time.
Definitely.
And the high frequencies first, at 33 RPM first, at the inner ear of the record first. That's where the first problems will start occurring.
It's just knowing that, like we just discussed, it's amazing that people still want to use conical styluses.
Yeah.
But again, you know, and there's another designer of expensive cartridge who insists that the reason they use conical stylus is because it sounds better. And I am not here to say that he can't hear or that he wasn't even right. What I am saying is that I doubt he was accounting for all of the variables in his little experiment, assuming he actually did it. All right, because it's certainly less expensive to buy a conical stylus than it is to buy a fine line contact stylus. Okay, assuming he did it, how did he account for was the tone arm? Because a conical stylus will be slightly less sensitive to an out of control tone arm than a fine line contact stylus. Okay, and there's just, I would like to know how he controlled the variables by being sure that a conical sounds better, because we know that it will throw off more distortion. And maybe it's because he likes extra second order or third order distortion.
Maybe it's his house sound.
Right?
Yeah, he just likes that sound.
Could be. But my point would be, I'm not saying it's a bad sounding cartridge.
No.
It could be better.
Yeah.
That's all.
JR, we're hearing a lot of people talking today about optical cartridges.
Yeah.
Have you had much experience with those?
Yeah, I have. The DS Audio cartridges are wonderful. And contrary to popular, I am hearing a lot of misunderstanding. People are thinking that they actually read the grooves optically. They don't. It's a stylus. Okay, that hasn't changed. This isn't the laser.
From years ago, shining a laser in there.
Which, remember, if there's undulations in the groove that are smaller than the wavelength of light, a laser, how would a laser read that?
Poorly.
Right. Okay. All right. So no, there is a stylus. It's just that attached to the cantilever, there's these two beryllium shutters, and on one side of the beryllium shutter is a LED light, and on the other side is a light sensor. And as the beryllium shutter, which is attached to the cantilever, which is attached to the stylus, as that shakes, it's going to change how the light is read, and that gets turned into electrical signal.
So it's modulating the light.
It's modulating the light.
Yeah.
So it's an opto-electrical device in there.
Yeah.
And they work wonderfully. Here's an interesting tale. So recently, the distributor of DS Audio cartridges reached out to me to photograph their new top-of-the-line cartridge. The Grandmaster EX has an integral stylus cantilever assembly made by Orbre. So it's a single piece, right? Single piece instead of a glue joint. So he sent me a Grandmaster EX and then also the Grandmaster. Now Grandmaster is similar in all respects to the Grandmaster EX, except it has a diamond cantilever and a diamond stylus, but they're glued, epoxied together. Okay, instead of being an integral piece. And then the coating on the body is a different color. EX has to be gold, right?
Right. Of course.
And so I analyzed both of these, and I mounted them both to separate Kuzma head shells with a corrective adapter, right? And that's another advantage of the Kuzma, though, by the way. If you've got multiple cartridges that are ideally mounted with a corrective shim in each head shell, you can change cartridges in less than 60, 75 seconds with all parameters nailed.
Right.
Yeah.
So I was able to do a quick A/B test for him of a new Grandmaster EX versus a new Grandmaster.
Okay.
And I did it blind, so he didn't know which is which. Within 2-3 bars, he turned around and he said, "This is the EX, isn't it?" I said, "Yep." And then he used the same adjectives I would have used to describe. A greater sense of musical flow, more inner detail, better transience, more clarity to the soundstage and overall presentation. Now, one subjective analysis and setup doesn't make a conclusion, right? In order to do this better, I would have to get 10 Grandmasters and 10 EXs and do it 10 times to make sure we got consistency and repeatability, right? But the difference was stark. It was easy it wasn't subtle. And think about it. If this really holds out over repeatability tests, that's one glue joint is the difference. One glue joint is lossy.
Wow, that's scary.
That is.
Yeah.
That is why I've got this. It's this type of thing why I'm so optimistic about vinyl's future, because there's other lossy opportunities. The tone arm, full of issues.
Yes.
Right. And the cartridge body itself.
Right.
I mean, ideally, the stylus cantilever assembly would mount directly into a single, well, ideally would mount directly to the tone arm.
Right.
But that's okay. So that there's no multiple pieces where each time you have 2 pieces, you're offering an opportunity for losses, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just...
Oh, Analog Magic? Have you ever played with
yes. So Analog Magic, they've got the same goal that that we have, you know, optimization, right? Their approach is they use a test record and electronic measurements to attempt to get an objective better, using just various types of distortion measurements, right? Because it's true, the better aligned this gets, the lower the distortion becomes. But I mentioned that, I don't know if I did it on air or not, but I got about 11 inches stack of laboratory test records, all different ones. And we've been analyzing test records.
Okay.
All right. Because in our studies of zenith error, we're coming across some unusual results that we can't fully explain. And so now we have to look at the test records. Is it in the test record, right? Because after all, you can mount a stylus cutter head to a cutter head, a cutting stylus to a cutter head, and misalign it on the cutting zenith, right?
Yes.
So there's a couple of ways for us to see how well test records are cut. One of them is using a microscope. We put it under the high power microscope. Look at, I like looking at the square waves, because square waves in a groove look like triangles.
Right.
And a triangle has an inside elbow and an outside elbow. So if you draw a line between the inside elbow and the outside elbow, draw a line, and you also, in the screen, using another method we came up with, identify the radial line, that is the line that goes from the center of the record to the edge of the record. Then the inside edge and the outside edge, that line should be perfectly parallel with the radial line. That means that this cutting stylus was properly lined, and that the path of the cutter head was also on that radial line, which it's supposed to be.
Right.
Yeah.
We've seen as much as 4.5 degrees off.
Wow.
Wow.
Now, this is on a test record. This is on a DIN test record, which are very hard to find because the engineers sweep them up when they can find them. All right. This is the German set of test records.
And these test records are supposed to be references.
That's right.
That you use as a benchmark.
CBS Labs, we're seeing the same thing.
Wow.
Right? Not quite to that degree, but still in the high 2-3% range.
Well, that's disappointing.
Yes. Well, so whenever you're being asked, so here's my point. Whenever you're being asked to trust a test record, you are then being asked to trust that it was set up perfectly at the lathe.
Yeah.
Now, then you might say, well, JR, with this kind of variation, why are we even bothering? It's all over the place, right? Which is a good question. But going back to what I said before, we know what the engineers are aiming for with their 4 angles. So at playback, if we also aim for them, then statistically we put ourselves in the best
possible
position
yeah.
to get the most out of all records.
Yeah.
And we can hear that.
Right.
The second thing I'd say about the analog magic system, and I love it when people who own the analog magic send me the cartridge for analysis.
Okay.
Because then they can hear it done my way. Right. And now the average SRA, remember I told you I database all cartridges that I analyze. The average SRA correction is over 3 degrees. I don't know a tone arm that can do 3 degrees. And if it could, I don't know that I would want it to, because a tone arm that's being played off level changes, imparts new vector forces around the bearing area. So, I rarely hear people who are using test records and distortion measurements to measure for ideal setup. I rarely ever hear them say, I can see that I need a wedge to get my butt down or my butt up.
Right.
Yeah.
I almost never hear that.
Right.
Right. And VTA, now SRA and VTA, obviously you can't change one without changing the other. But the average VTA correction is almost 7 degrees.
That's huge.
And I'm using a really forgiving goal, 22 degrees or under. Okay.
Yeah.
I would like it to be 20 degrees or under, because there are no torque tubes. There are no torque tubes that are cutting lacquers that end up at 30 plus degrees. But yet there are cartridge manufacturers who are regularly jacking up their cantilevers to 30 plus degrees because there are certain manufacturing advantages for them to do so. But it's not it's not good for fidelity. Okay. So you're being asked to trust a test record. I know that there's probably a test record in our future, but we're going to spell out in our literature how we can promise that we hit it. Right. Right? Which I've never seen in any liner notes on any test record.
No, you're right.
Right?
Yeah.
And the distortion measurements, the other problem with the distortion, taking purely distortion measurements, even if you did have a perfect test record, another problem with taking distortion measurements is that it's a multivariate environment. When you change any one parameter, you will change the results for measuring all the other parameters. All right. So if you're, say, using the test to measure for ideal rake angle, depending on the horizontal forces on your arm will change those distortion measurements. Depending on your VTF will change those distortion measurements. Depending on your zenith error or attempted correction thereof will change those distortion measurements. So it becomes really difficult to understand what the measurements are telling you. And so you are forced into this iterative method where you have to make many, many, many adjustments in the hopes of watching all of them come down, 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 until you hit some point where you've got your arm like this because you're not using a shim. And now the arm is going to create new problems. Okay. But the measurements don't say your arm is the problem. It just says we got these new distortion measurements. We can't tell you where it's from because it could be any multiplicity of things, right? There are 7 alignment targets in analog setup. 7. There's 1 linear dimension, there are 2 forces, and there are 4 angles. And we know what they are. So the whole premise of what we do at RAM Engineering is let's use a univariate approach where possible. It's not possible with azimuth, by the way. Where possible, use a univariate approach to nail them so that you know with certainty, you got that one right, now move to the next one, right? With azimuth, it's not possible because azimuth requires a test record. Azimuth, some people think that you adjust azimuth by using a mirror and getting the stylus and cantilever perfectly. No, it has nothing to do. The stylus is designed to ride wonky in the groove and still be perfect. That's why there's something called a major radius. I did a video on this, on azimuth, with an animation showing that it's optimizing for azimuth, which is maximizing channel separation, is purely a function of the groove wall, the 45-degree groove wall, and the coil former way back here. It's that relationship that defines maximum channel stereo separation, not the position of the groove, rather the stylus in the groove. Now, depending on the cut of the stylus, there is a maxima at which point you shouldn't be going past that. You will be causing the stylus will start touching the surface where the land of the record touches the groove wall. That's called a horn. Yeah, you don't want that. Okay, so there is a maxima, right?
There you go.
Yeah.
Rick, do you have any questions?
No, I mean, he gave us so much information.
Yeah.
You know, I thought it was great. I mean, I learned a tremendous amount. So thank you very much, JR.
Yeah, definitely appreciate your time today. Yeah. It was great. And safe travels. And
Thank you.
Where are you off to next? You're going up to D.C., you said?
In Boston, dropped my daughter off at Boston College, and then I got a couple of clients in D.C., yeah.
Oh, you're busy.
Yeah.
Are you coming to the Florida Audio Expo this year?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. We'll love to have you. Yeah. And that'll be in late February. And yeah, it's actually almost sold out. Have you talked to Bart, the Bart man? And
Bart's got me locked in.
He's got you locked in.
He's got me locked in. And, you know, my son is starting at University of Tampa, so I'm going to be coming here more often.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. Come and visit anytime.
Yeah, we're just an hour away.
Fantastic.
Yep, exactly.
Maybe it gives me an excuse to buy a new cartridge.
Yeah.
I'll send it to JR, get it tweaked, and off we go.
There we go.
Cool. Well, thanks again for everything. Appreciate it. It was great chatting with you, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you.